All right, Ben Coley is here. Ben, it's been a long time coming, man. We've been talking about getting together on a podcast for a number of years now, I believe, at this point, and I'm so glad to have you finally join me.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I feel like I've been making excuses for the last year and a half at least. We've got a second kid in the house now, so it's hard to find the time, but we've made it work, and I'm glad.
You've been a busy man. I just told you off air. I was just listening to your podcast Slice this morning. How's that been going? How has been your introduction to the podcast world been treating you thus far in 2025?
So far, so good. Yeah, it's been nice to talk with Sam again, Sam Harrop, who I've known for a long time, but not seen for a while, and we've really enjoyed doing it. We were only on episode 6, but we had Laurie Cantor on today. Had a really good chat with him. We've got Paul McGinley coming up in a few weeks as well, and we're hoping to have Justin Rose later in the year. So we're getting some hopefully those big names who elevators from. I appreciate people have only got so much time. There are so many great podcasts around, and it's hard to find your way into that space. But so far, so good. Yeah.
Do you feel like you're better at, because you're such a talented writer, and I really appreciate your written previews because I think the written word is becoming more and more of a lost art as the audio platform continues to take. And I love writing myself. I actually think I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker personally. And I still write about 5,000 words every week at Inside Sports Network on the golf tournament. Do you think you're a stronger writer or in the audio format in terms of communicating your ideas? Because I go back and forth on this one myself in terms of which I actually prefer.
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm a better writer than I am a broadcaster. That's the one I choose to be good at, which is maybe incongruous with the nature of the world we live in and the nature of content. But I do enjoy the different format and having someone to bounce off, because obviously writing,
Agreed.
it's a blank piece of paper. You go the direction you choose to go, and I'm definitely guilty of, you know, deciding what I want to write about and sort of flogging an argument to death sometimes, and having someone to bring you back around or to offer a different point of view is great. But if I could only do one, it would be writing. And look, I say this to my boss sometimes, and thankfully I think he agrees with me. Like, the one thing that endures in the world of media is the written word. And
Agreed.
whatever the new trends are in 20, 30 years, I still think there will be space for writing things down.
Agreed. We'll keep fighting the good fight. I'm excited. We'll get to Torrey in a moment, but before we dive into the odds boards with Torrey, did you catch much of the golf this past weekend in Phoenix, and any big takeaways from Thomas Dietrich's 7-stroke victory at the Waste Management Phoenix Open? A sentence I never thought that I would utter in my lifetime covering golf, particularly the 7 strokes aspect of it.
No, it was phenomenal, wasn't it? And I enjoyed watching it. It's always fun to see a player like him figure it all out. And, sometimes people say, don't they? Oh, well, when he wins, it'll be from 5 back and he'll post a score and all. And I always say that what he wants is not that. What he wants is a really, really big lead, and then we'll see how he does. Because actually, if you go back through Dietrich, he's had a few chances that have slipped through his fingers. But I don't know as he'd ever led by more than a shot going into the final round, and maybe not even that. I feel like about a year ago I had a look, and he'd never held a solo 54-hole lead, apart from when he won by, I think he won by about 15 shots on the Challenge Tour. So that's clearly where he feels somewhat comfortable. I know he talked about some new techniques and meditation that he's been doing. He's a family man now with 2 kids, and look, it's just taken him a bit of time. But the whole result really is so different to what we've grown used to at Scottsdale. It's been a tournament that's really delivered the drama. It's generally been won by the same names or players who are very much proven. And we've seen players like Thomas come up short in the past. So credit to him. I suppose my one big takeaway is just at the moment that gap between players like him and all but 3 players on the PGA Tour, Scheffler, Schauffele, and McIlroy, is probably as narrow as it's ever been. And we've had a run of winners like Harris English, like Nick Taylor, like Sepp Straka, Thomas Dietrich, all from that next tier all not complete long shots that nobody could have figured out, but all from further down the betting than people like Sung Jae Im and Patrick Cantlay and so on and so forth. And those players should be looking around and thinking, our sort of status here is under threat, because there are a lot of those elite golfers who are not winning golf tournaments at the moment. And it's given an opportunity for players like Thomas Dietrich to step up, and he grabbed it with both hands.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've been talking about this and thinking about this for a couple weeks, and I actually went with a different betting strategy last week, and I did not have Thomas Dietrich on the card, but it did at least pay off for me in the sense where I had a lot of guys in the mix on Sunday with at least a chance with Rasmus, Mav, and Daniel Berger. And it was the first time all year, because I think the biggest mistake that I've made so far in 2025 is exactly what you just touched upon, is actually overrating the tier of golfers that aren't Scotty, Rory, Xander's obviously hurt, but I think I've given a little too much credit to the Patrick Cantlay 22-1 bets, or a little too much credit to the Colin Morikawa 16-1 bets, or I bet Justin Thomas at 14-1 at Pebble Beach, which was not my finest moment, right? And I decided to make a card last week at the Phoenix Open. I bet 11 guys with Tom Kim at 45-1, and every single other person was above 65-1. And I didn't have Dietrich on that card, but at least I walked into Sunday with 3-4 guys with a genuine chance under 12-1 heading into Sunday. And I wonder if this flood the zone overwhelm with mass and grab a bunch of guys in that 40 to 120 zone may actually be the more optimal strategy until we start seeing players like Colin, Cantlay, Ludvig, Justin Thomas pay off their price. I understand that because of their talent level. I'm not asking that any of those players should be in the 40 or 50-1 range, but I've found myself leaving feeling a lot more to be desired about that group of players that typically get priced around 20-1 this year in 2025.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I suppose the risk is that we're coming to this a little bit late. I mean, it would have been a great strategy to have
Seriously.
To have seen it at the start of January. And what will be interesting is to see whether it plays out into these signature events. And generally speaking, they have been dominated. There've been a couple of exceptions, but they've been dominated by the very best players in the game. And you'd include Hideki in that. He's probably the one that, over the last 12, 14 months, he's won 3 times, right? So he's probably the one. Although he kind of fit in this category you're talking about, because at Riviera last year he was 66-1 even.
He was even 35-1 at Century, I believe.
Right. So there you go. I mean, that's he's probably the one exception if you look at the game's elite players who are just that one rung behind. And Hideki's a kind of in some ways a unique exception, because we know that his A game. I always say that when we have those conversations about whose best golf is the best, and that can be kind of a bit of a nebulous thing, and we can't pin down exactly what it means, but I would definitely say that Hideki is the one who, in terms of his ceiling, is probably closest. Him and Colin, you'd say, are probably closest to the big 3 as we now have them, the big 4 if you include John Rahm. But signature events by and large have been fairly predictable, and even McIlroy was not, 12, 14, 16 at best for Pebble Beach, and wasn't necessarily on many people's radars.
Right.
But it was another example of these events still going the way of the form book. But it's those non-signature events like Phoenix, and I'm sure we'll see it again. I mean, we've got a couple of the ones in Florida coming up, the Cognizant and the Valspar, and
sure.
You definitely want to be looking down the odds board in those.
2 more closing thoughts, Ben, from Phoenix before we fully transition into Torrey. I want to ask you about 2 players, and I mainly want to ask you about if their performance in Phoenix changed your opinion on them going forward. Scotty Scheffler and Jordan Spieth. Start with Scotty, and then give me any broader takeaways on both Spieth and Scotty's performance, both what you saw in Phoenix and how it pertains to your optimism or lack thereof of both those golfers going forward.
Well, I suppose, first of all, full disclosure, I was on Scotty Scheffler for his first win in
At
Phoenix.
me as well. Gosh, wasn't that great, Ben, when we used to bet him 28-1?
No, the glory days. And I
I
remember
know.
actually, I had him about 16-1 for the BMW Championship later that year, which he was in that putting funk, or one of his several putting funks since then, and I managed not to win when he probably should have. But I should admit that I've not been on him for any of his wins since, right? Including the Masters at 16, including the Masters the second time at whatever he was
Me as
last
well.
year. Whether I've been guilty of underestimating him or not, I don't know. I don't think I'd ever have said, oh, he's not this, that, or the other. It's more that for me, getting my head around taking 5-1 about someone in a world-class golf tournament is really difficult. I don't want to rush to judgment with him. I know he only had a month off and it was a minor hand injury, but he's probably hurried his return a little bit, and he came back at Pebble Beach, which is not where he perhaps he obviously wanted to come back in the Amex, which is more familiar to him. Phoenix was interesting because he's probably 3 holes away from it looking like a fantastic top 3 finish, and we're all set.
He was tied for 3rd with 9 holes to play, and he finished 25th.
Crazy. I mean, and we've not seen him do that really. There've been, I suppose, the PGA Championship last year, unique circumstances were involved there, but there have been a couple of times where he's sort of blown out. But it can happen to anybody. I suppose with him, I don't really see any reason to be at all concerned. Jordan's interesting, and I mean, just one other thing on Scotty though. Like I said this on our podcast Sliced a few weeks ago. Wherever he is with his game, there's a very strong chance that 2024 will prove to be the best year of his career. It was such a good year. We can't spend all winter talking about how it stacks up with Tiger Woods' best golf and then just expect that he keeps doing it. Like it would not surprise me at all if he remains the best golfer, but that Rory closes the gap. I think we're seeing that happening. With Jordan, I'm intrigued by that because obviously he's had surgery and there's a big change there to his capabilities physically, and clearly he should have done it sooner. I think it's crazy he wasn't made to do it sooner. It seems really, really strange to me that he didn't do that. But if it is as simple an equation as the fact that his wrist doesn't hurt anymore allows him to strike his irons in the way he used to, then why not expect big things from him? The market has reacted really quickly this week. That will be the challenge, and I'm sure we're about 2 more good performances from him going off at the same price as Ludvig for the Masters. So whether you'll be able to capitalize on this, I don't know. But it's, at least as purely as a golf fan, it's really exciting. It's probably the most exciting thing that's happened this year, away from the finishes of the tournaments, is seeing Jordan Spieth back on a leaderboard.
Yeah, certainly. I think more takeaways from Spieth, certainly for me, to answer the question. I think that Scotty's performance this past week in Phoenix doesn't do a whole lot for me positively or negatively. I think the end result is a touch misleading in that, like I mentioned, there's a guy that finished 25th in the tournament and was 5-1 to win the entire tournament with 9 holes to play on Sunday, and had just come off a 31 on the front 9. It seems like the one thing that has been slow to return from Scotty under the very limited sample size of really 8 competitive rounds, and this does track a little bit for me, just in terms of my own experience returning from long absences playing golf, it does seem like short game can take a few starts for the touch and feel around the greens to fully come back to those levels. I mean, the thing that gets underrated with Scheffler and all of this is that there were so many components that allowed Scheffler to have the 2024 that he had. It wasn't just because he'd become the best overall driver of the ball in the world. It wasn't just because he'd become the best middle iron player, but he also developed into, at worst, a top 5 around the green player in the entire world. I mean, he was consistently towards the top of around the green play and bunker play on the PGA Tour in 2024. And at least in his first 2 starts, he's lost around a stroke and a half, 2 strokes around the greens. I'm going to be pretty fascinated to monitor that at Torrey, Ben, because this is a golf course with a lower greens and regulation percentage that we're going to see this week, more so than Pebble Beach and Phoenix. So, the greenside surrounds at Torrey, especially with that super thick, lush hack out rough that Scheffler has actually had a lot of success out of in the past. In terms of a degree of difficulty standpoint, it's not like the most difficult, precise around the green play required at Torrey Pines, but in terms of sheer volume, in terms of the amount that you're often going to have to rely on your short game at Torrey, I think that's something to monitor for me. I mean, turning the page here, Ben, we're back here for the second time in 2 weeks. Do you have any broad overhanging macro thoughts on Torrey Pines and our return there before we dive into the odds board?
Well, it makes sense as the place to go. I know it's not the most spectacular course in golf, despite the location. It is well used to hosting big players and big tournaments, and to be able to do so on short notice. It was one of maybe 3 options. I was kind of, I warmed to the idea of going to PGA West, actually.
That was interesting. I think getting something in California was a priority. I'm sitting right here a mile away from Riviera. I could walk to Riviera from my living room. And while I'm devastated that we do not have professional golf here this week because it has become my favorite weeks of the year going to this tournament, it didn't make sense at all. And I think the criticisms and nitpickings of venue selection, giving the true nature of the disaster that is happening here in the Palisades, that I think a lot of people are still not in totally in tune with just how bad it is here right now. I think overall we could probably look past our misgivings with Torrey and take a victory as a victory that we're even getting golf this week.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, look, I hope everybody in your circle is okay. It's obviously from afar. It's very hard for us in the UK to comprehend. It's not a problem really that we have to deal with a great deal. And yeah, I mean, anyone who's losing their temper over a golf tournament is probably losing a sense of perspective, right? We've got a tournament. We've not got Tiger Woods, by the way, which is a shame, isn't it?
Late breaking news, by the way. Thanks for bringing that up. That dropped about 10 minutes before we started recording.
Yeah, it's a shame. Obviously, the passing of his mother last week. You know, I don't think I'll pick up golf clubs when that happens to me. So yeah, again, another big picture, right? It's just a golf tournament. I suspect he'd have struggled, but it sounds like he might get there for the weekend anyway. And, you know, one of the great things about winning the Genesis Invitational is that you get that trophy presented to you by Tiger Woods on Sunday. And I suspect that will happen again.
I will say this about Torrey, Ben, and I talked about this a little bit on my Sunday podcast. It's going to be a lot wetter than we saw 2 weeks ago. I can tell you that definitively. It poured in LA over the last couple of days. I checked in with some buddies in San Diego and they said the same thing. They've gotten a lot more rain. And it actually reminds me a little bit of what we saw in 2024. So, you know, I go to Torrey every single year. And last year, it was soaking wet. I mean, I literally remember showing up there on Thursday, walking a couple of holes, and you know my feet were soaking wet with the thickness and the lushness of the rough. And this past year at Torrey Pines, the one that Harris English won, it was a lot drier. The golf course played a lot firmer and faster. California was in a bit of a drought. This is, you know, right before all the fires. And you know, when Torrey Pines plays softer and more receptive, it plays a lot longer. It actually does play a little bit easier, to be honest with you, Ben, because the greens are easier to hold and you have so many long iron approach shots that when you get softer, more receptive greens, that actually helps out the scoring average a little bit. But it actually even gives more credence to distance in this case, in my opinion. And you look at that 2024 leaderboard, and 9 of the top 12 players on that leaderboard, Ben, ranked top 25 in distance. I mean, Matthew Pavone was a bit of a red herring, and he just putted his butt off and was a phenomenal long iron player. But as soon as you get past Pavone, it's Hojgaard, it's Knapp, it's Ludvig, it's Xander, it's Finau, it's Stefan Jaeger. I mean, these are amongst the longest players on the PGA Tour. Whereas this past year in 2025, the Harris English year, it actually turns a little bit more into a scrambling fest when it plays a little bit firmer and faster. And you look at the top of the leaderboard at Torrey Pines a couple weeks ago, and it's actually like a lot of short game and overall approach play playing a massive role in this tournament. I ascertain, just looking at the weather right now, that this is going to be more of a 2024 redux than a 2025 redux. Does that track for you at all?
Well, it's encouraging for me to hear that, because obviously, again, we have to make these judgments from a lot further away. And I looked at the forecast. It sounds like they've had a bit of rain in San Diego, and there's certainly a lot more to come. It'd be interesting to see how it affects play, because from memory in 2024, really wet underfoot, but actually the weather was really good once the tournament started.
It was. Yeah. And that's why the scoring wasn't that crazy. I mean, it played about 0.5 over par. And for context, this past year at Torrey played 1.67 over par. And if you're asking me to project, I think we're probably looking closer to 0.5 than we are to 1.67, if I had to make a guess.
Yeah, and I mean that was the dynamic of this year's tournament, wasn't it? The wind that came across on the Thursday, the second round of the Farmers, and that in itself, I think, is one thing to look a little bit closer at, because there was a draw bias of about 2 shots across the north-south versus south-north. Essentially, you didn't want to be on the north course in round 2. And if you look actually at one player who is Thomas Dietrich. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he's come out and already won. And so was Shane Lowry, and he's come out and finished second at Pebble Beach. So looking at those players who were stuck on the north course in round 2 is one way to get into it. And I think if you combine that with what you're saying about conditions underfoot, one name who springs to mind immediately is Tony Finau, who has such a fantastic record here and started well at the south course, all ready to go and shoot the 66, 67 he'd have needed at the north course, and all of a sudden it's borderline unplayable. And that'd be an interesting thing to look closer at. But I think certainly, I mean, even this year, right, Sam Stevens, who's another player who got the worst of the draw, if he wins and if Nikolai Højgaard wins, we can look at the winners of this golf tournament and say, well, look, you've got to hit it miles to win at Torrey. And in general, I think you're right to point out that often we can just look at a winner of a tournament. We can look at Nick Taylor winning the Phoenix Open and think that that is the most informative piece of information. But actually, it's a broader look at the top 20, 25 players.
100% agreed. And we will certainly get to Finau, because I think what Finau does, and there are a couple players that fall into this category, whether it be Tony Finau, Taylor Pendrith is another good example of this. Sam Stevens is another good example of this. But I mean, the top of the mountain for, I think, the skill set that both you and I are touching upon is the combination of power off the tee and long iron play. And I look at the top of the leaderboard, or top of the odds board this week, and I actually say to myself, this is actually, in my opinion, one of the few spots setup related where I think the gap between Rory and Scotty is somewhat closer on a skill set standpoint. And the reason why I say that is simple, is that Scotty Scheffler is generally overall still a better overall statistical, more well-rounded golfer than Rory McIlroy, in the sense that it kind of goes back and forth on them a lot of times, in terms of, there are times when Rory's putting better than Scotty. There are times when Rory has a better short game than Scotty. There's times when Rory is hitting his long irons better than Scotty. But often it goes back and forth between the two, with Scotty generally having the edge in a lot of the ancillary skill sets than Rory in terms of his consistency. The one thing that Rory always does better than Scotty, no matter what, that does not change, is his carry distance, right? Rory is just an objectively longer player off the tee than Scotty. And so I look at Torrey Pines this week and I say, okay, this is going to be one of the more distance biased golf courses on the PGA Tour. And I think about a colder, wet, thick, rough, 8,000 yards. I mean, my brain still even goes to those 2014 congressionals, where on a soft golf course, Rory just basically starts on third base when the rest of the field is starting on first. In my opinion, and I'm not saying I'm revving up the engine to fire on Rory at 7-1, but in my opinion, these are pretty advantageous conditions for Rory McIlroy.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and in the end, he had them at Pebble Beach as well. You know, Pebble Beach was pretty soft, and if anything, I go back and forth on the argument. I think it's generally overplayed, but lower scoring conditions in general, sort of that mid-teens, are probably where Rory's most comfortable. But we're probably splitting hairs a little bit there. The thing for me is, and to some extent, it's a mental block, right? And you shouldn't let it influence you. But and I tweeted about this on the eve of Pebble Beach. There was a narrative that Pebble Beach is some sort of big problem for Rory, when actually that was based on playing it once with his dad because he wanted to tick off a bucket list
Sure.
experience, and playing sort of moderately in a US Open in a one-off golf tournament. And that played into a price about Rory McIlroy, which we almost never get. Sort of a bigger price than he was for any of the four majors at that time, a bigger price, twice the price he was to win at Quail Hollow last year, and so on and so forth. And I really, really regret not having followed that. It's actually quite rare. You know, when you do this as often as you and I do, every single week we're looking at the market. It's very rare that the market surprises you. And it was hard for me to know how to react. And I reacted the wrong way. The reaction should always be to follow the market and to bet the market and not the player. That's probably the best way to put it. So having missed Rory at almost 16 to 1 over here, to go in again at 7 to 1 against the same field effectively, even allowing for the fact that Torrey Pines arguably is even better for him, is a difficult one to comprehend. That being said, I'm in total agreement with you. Where the gap between him and Scheffler is around a course like this, I would say you're getting very, very close to putting them on level terms. So yeah, I mean, McIlroy here, and the other thing just to point out with him, and I'm sure it's been said plenty of times, but I'm still really interested in this idea that last October he went and looked at his swing and tried to fix something, and he's come out and played 4 times since. He's won twice. He's been 4th and 3rd in the other 2. Generally, his wedge play looks better, and all these things he's saying about actually looking at what Scheffler does and trying to learn from it, trying to limit the mistakes. It's hard not to get really excited about what that could mean for him, because you know he's 1% away from being the best golfer on earth again. So it could happen this year.
I'm close, Ben. I think my buy number on him was about 8, 8 plus 850, 9 to 1. I think I probably would have put all of my eggs in that basket, and maybe a 8 or 9 to 1 appears later in the week. I highly doubt it once the narrative of how Torrey Pines is going to take shape from a condition standpoint, and the Rory steam gets going. I've already seen quite a bit of it on Monday morning. I doubt we're going to get that price. I'm passing, but I'm afraid of him. I'll put it that way. I wanted to put it into public record that I think this is as close to an ideal setup for Rory McIlroy. And yet, with that being said, I'm taking the strategy once again of flooding the zone in the 40 to 80 range. And I've made a couple bets in the 40, 50 range that I want to talk about. But before we get there, I mean, I want to ask you about players like Justin Thomas, like Colin Morikawa. We're starting to see some drift out of Patrick Cantlay into the 30s and Ludvig. How do you assess this next range of the odds board once we get past Rory and Scotty?
Well, the one who really makes me think twice is Cantlay, for the exact reason you've said.
Drift,
So
yeah.
I fell into, I know you said you bet Thomas and it wasn't your finest hour at Pebble Beach. Well, I had a very similar experience. I bet Morikawa and Cantlay. I felt that McIlroy and Scheffler were both vulnerable. I was wrong on Rory. And I felt that if they were vulnerable, then really we're looking at a big time player to win these events. And actually, had it not been Rory, it probably would have been Shane. And although he's not won as many as he should have, he certainly qualifies. Cantlay is the interesting one because they were sort of 14 and 16 to 1 there, and Colin's come back having not played since, and he's still 14 to 1. And Cantlay's come back having not played since, and he's doubled in price. And actually, they finished a few shots apart. And of the two, it was Cantlay who was early on, who looked like he might be the man to beat. So he's interesting. And I know, part of this is to do with their respective records at Torrey Pines, but actually Cantlay's not played it a lot. He's played it once since the US Open. It came probably at a time when he was a little preoccupied and wasn't at his best. So he definitely is just at a number. Whenever Patrick Cantlay is the same price as, say, Taylor Pendrith, who of course has a great game for this, I think there's a risk that there's been an overreaction there. With regards Colin, it just feels like we're in a very similar situation with Justin Thomas. We're waiting for that tournament to come along where one of them wins. Either one of those winning the Players' Championship this year seems entirely feasible to me. I think 14 around here with the course playing longer. I think he was a better bet at Pebble Beach, to be honest with you, where he played perfectly well but didn't putt very well.
I will tell you this about this middle tier, and I'm talking about players like Colin, Justin Thomas, Hideki, Ludvig, Sungjae, even getting into Fleetwood, Tom Kim, Cantlay. I'm probably going to find someone in there. And I do actually want to mention Ludvig only based on the fact that, this is a player that was 9-1 at Torrey Pines a few weeks ago. And I think we all had a lot of excitement, and that excitement rose to a bit of a breaking point when he opened up. He was leading round one after shooting, I believe, like -9 on the North course. Then it came out that he was battling with a bit of a sickness over the final couple of days of tour, and he fell all the way down the leaderboard into a tie for 42nd, and then withdrew the following week at Pebble Beach. If you liked Ludvig, which I know many of us did, at Torrey Pines a few weeks ago, I would actually think that this version of Torrey Pines is even more advantageous for Ludvig, because I think the biggest flaw right now statistically in Ludvig's game is he's still not great around the greens. And the putter comes and goes. There's some putting upside there, but realistically, it's more around the greens that has been more consistently an issue for him. We've seen the high tail of Ludvig's putting ability. I mean, he led the Masters in putting. I actually think a longer, colder 8,000-yard Torrey Pines is almost even more advantageous for Ludvig. You just have to, be concerned about the tail end of a sickness. But from a course fit, I don't see any reason to be any lower on Ludvig at this price than we were when he was tournament favorite a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, totally. I agree with everything you said there. I tipped him at 9-1. I was very confident that, for me, it was sort of a maximum each way bet. I thought in that field around those two golf courses, the prospect of him not finishing in the top 10 was very, very small. Unfortunately, he got sick, and that's, it's one of those things. Ultimately, he missed a heck of a lot of really short putts, and you think, well, actually, yeah, his head was probably spinning. He's dosed up to the eyeballs on whatever he was taking it, and he's a Torrey Pines. So I wish we could have seen him play since. I wish we could know for sure how he's feeling. He could be one where you just sit and wait, and I've not seen the media schedule for the week. I imagine he probably isn't set to speak with the media, but I'm sure some Swedish reporter will grab him or whatever, and we might get a word on how he's feeling, because yeah, you're right. I preferred him to Hideki then, and I would prefer him again, actually, because Torrey Pines just feels like a great, great golf course for him. And that first round at the North course, I know it's the North course, but he was still 3 shots better than anybody else. And it was 330 yards center of the fairway all day. It could have been lower. And it no way would it surprise me if we see that version of Ludvig for a lot longer this time.
I'm going to give you, Ben, as we start to wrap up and get towards the back end of the odds board, I'm going to give you the quick case on the 3 bets that I've made already on Monday morning. And I have a lot of room, and hopefully talking through it a little bit will help you solidify how I want to fill out the rest of my card this week. But the 3 bets that I've made thus far, I'll give you the first one. I bet Taylor Pendrith at 45-1. And I mentioned briefly on my Sunday podcast that I almost think this goes one of 2 ways with Taylor Pendrith. I have been betting and playing this guy into the ground over the past couple of months. I mean, he's been an absolute top 20 machine at he has the exact skill set at Torrey Pines that I'm looking for. He murders the ball off the tee. He's actually a phenomenal putter that could almost win this in a similar way that Pavone did under a case where it actually plays a little bit easier and we see a higher greens in regulation percentage. He has that putting upside as well. And I think the positive outcome of this is he's Wyndham Clark in 2024, right? And this is his Quail Hollow, where he just has that breakout season. and he gets the signature event win before, it's become a joke in my little community because all of us have already bet these massive futures on Taylor Pendrith at Oakmont. But the parallels are hard to ignore in some senses, both from a skill set standpoint and just a state of play standpoint to what we saw from Wyndham Clark, where this player basically I'm not saying Taylor Pendrith is the most talented, best golfer in the world, but in terms of optimizing your ability for modern PGA Tour golf courses and equipment, Taylor Pendrith and Wyndham Clark are both players that could have very long, successful careers on the PGA Tour for an extremely long time based on the specific things that they do well. I guess the negative tail on this outcome for Pendrith is this is just the heat check performance, where it's like, okay, at the end of the day, you're still Taylor Pendrith. There's still a level for you to go before you get thought about and talked about in the same conversation of the players that you're starting to be priced around. But I'm hoping for outcome number one with Pendrith. Finau, you touched on as well. I'll let you do more of the sell on Finau if you're with me on that. But I think he has somewhat of a B- C+ version of what we talked about with Rory. He has the insane carry distance off the tee. He has the high end tail with his long irons. Finau has been inconsistent this year, but remains a phenomenal long iron player and has a fantastic history at Torrey Pines as well, I might add. And then I also bet Adam Scott at 90-1, and I'll tell you why. First of all, Adam Scott has very underrated distance. I mean, he still hits the ball an incredibly long way into his mid-40s. He's a super underrated putter as well, too. And he's been playing some quietly excellent golf to start the season, particularly on approach. And I still believe that he may have one more big one before he rides off into the sunset. I don't necessarily believe it's going to be a major, but I mean, he's played phenomenal at Torrey Pines in the past. And I actually think that he almost underratedly has a lot of the skill set that I think we're looking for, in my opinion, at a pretty appetizing price of 90-1. So that's how I'm attacking it.
He was in my team for Pebble Beach, actually, for many of the same reasons. And he closed off with a 64, I think. He was never in the tournament, but played really well on Sunday. The one thing with Adam as well, I think if you dig through the numbers, that if anything, the North Course has probably held him back a little bit over the years. And actually, if they'd had the Farmers only on the South Course, his record would have been even better than it already is. Finau, as you mentioned, I think he's perfect for this. I mean, he's had 2 very good putting weeks this year and 2 very bad ones, and we'll see how that goes, right? But historically, his record on the South Course is phenomenal. I think he's low around 64. It feels like he's been a Farmers winner waiting to happen. And in some ways, it'd be pretty Tony Finau to win the Farmers when it's not actually the Farmers.
Right.
And we get, he was 20-1 for the Farmers. And he is in general, I know this may not stack up perfectly well with the fact that when he had his hot run a couple of years ago, he's winning events like Mexico and the 3M and the Rocket Mortgage, these second tier events where you are being asked to take 12, 14-1. So he kind of changed the narrative during that run. But for me personally, he's still a golfer I'd like to have on side at 40-1 and take my chances on the putter, because how he putts is not affected by the strength of the field. So, whether it's the best players in the world or not, Tony Finau can be the 70th best putter that week and you've got no chance. But if he can putt well, then he clearly is capable of beating anybody. And I like the number this week. Pendrith, I think you've made the point well. And look, just to make this even less likely to happen, I am also on him for a couple of big prices. I think Quail Hollow for the USPGA, if you get a 3-figure price still, I think he's probably worth to go there.
Do you have anyone to add, Ben, that I haven't touched upon? I mean, there are a lot of players, once you dig a little bit deeper, that do a lot of the things that we're talking about narratively, right? I mean, I'm talking about guys like Bobby Mack, Rasmus, even getting deeper into players like Cameron Davis and Jake Knapp. Do you have any long shots or even guys that we haven't mentioned that you believe deserve a real shout from either of us?
So just a couple. Will Zalatoris is one now. People were falling over themselves.
50-1. Yeah.
Yeah. It just feels like And the thing with him as well, I do think somewhat, if he finished 15th at Pebble Beach, we might be talking 33-1. And
Agreed.
he's played Pebble Beach 3 times now, and that was actually his best yet. So Pebble Beach and Will Zalatoris do not seem to align at the moment, whereas Torrey Pines, clearly, he really should have won this when Luke List did, and a couple of other times he's been right there. So he's one who's sort of got my attention, and he did at least shoot his best 2 rounds over the weekend at Pebble Beach. A couple of others to mention. I think Min Woo Lee's playing beautifully. I think it's a case of figuring out where it really happens for him. He's got probably Florida feels like it might be worth waiting for. But he hits the ball a mile and he's got brilliant hands. So that's a pretty good start point. You mentioned Sam Stevens, who just loves it here. But the one who I've kept coming back to is actually Akshay Bhatia. He played well here. I think he was 13th or 14th last year. And I mean, at his best, he's a fabulous driver of the ball, and we started to see that over the weekend. I think for 3 of the 4 rounds in Phoenix, and actually because he played well on Thursday, he was in with the media, and someone, I think the first question was, "Oh, it's been a bit of a slow start to the year. You're not playing very well," and he said, "Oh no." I think he said something like something good's definitely coming, and he's just finished 30th every week for 4 weeks. And I always look at golfers like that and think, you know what, that's a putt here or there. It's whatever. It's not a big gap between finishing 5th every week in some examples. So Akshay, obviously, is Californian. Obviously, he's got great form by the coast. Poana, not a problem. I think he's one to be interested in.
The only other player I would mention, as we get super deep here into the hundreds, I've been hesitantly encouraged by what I'm seeing from Gary Woodland this year. I mean, he's now 3 top 25 finishes in a row to start the season. He obviously has a pretty strong track record of success on the West Coast before, in Pebble Greens, winning at Pebble Beach. He's gained strokes in both ball striking categories in all 3 starts to open the season. And he's actually putting okay for him, which is, Gary is the type of player based on his long iron play and driving ability, where if you can get him to be a slight positive on the greens, there's generally a pretty decent chance that he's finishing in the top 20. I think there's another golf course that is going to accentuate some of the things that Gary does best, but I don't really have anyone else top of mind that I wanted to throw out there. I'm looking at Jason Day at 45-1 as well. I didn't previously mention Jason Day. He's obviously has a phenomenal history at Torrey Pines. I think he as well has some underrated distance and can get super hot. Phenomenal POA history as well, putting on these greens and at Torrey Pines. Has played excellent at Torrey Pines under similar conditions when it's colder and wetter. I don't have anyone else, Ben. Anyone we missed?
I don't think so. No, that probably just about covers it. I mean, Mav McNeely, probably one that
Sure.
I really like where he is in the putter fired last week. There is just one actually. I'm still in 2 minds, but Cam Young is made for this, right? I mean,
right.
Everything we said, we almost as if we've been saving this. But the thing with Cam Young as well is if you dive deeper into, he's played this tournament twice. The first time he wasn't even a full Corn Ferry Tour member. He Monday qualified. And he Monday qualified on a really hard golf course. And he came here and missed the cut, but his round at the South course was good. It's like he gained strokes on the field. And his ball striking numbers were really good during that. And then he came back in, I think 2021 was that his rookie season. He'd finished 40th and missed cut first 2 starts of the season, and he finished mid-pack here. But again, he was undone by the North course and the putter. It's a great golf course for him. Now, last week he was, I think, 5th in putting and still managed to finish a couple of shots outside the top 10. He's just infuriating, as everybody by now knows, but a long, soft golf course where he has that X factor off the tee. He doesn't need to putt anything like as well as he did last week, as long as he can just improve his approach play a little bit. I think he's interesting. The thing for me is just that his price is, I'm looking twice at it. I kind of hope we might get a bit bigger.
Ben, this was an absolute pleasure, my friend, and hopefully the first of many. Tell listeners where can they find your work? I know obviously your column every week, I would imagine there's a ton of crossover support. I certainly know that as a fact when I mentioned that you were joining me in our Discord this morning. But talk a little bit about your new podcast, what you're going for, why people should check it out, why it may be a little bit different from what folks are used to hearing in the typical golf betting podcast space.
Yeah, well, thank you for allowing me to do so. It's called Sliced Golf Podcast. It turns out that was a bad idea because when you put that into YouTube, you just get swing tips and what have you. But maybe you can fix your golf game while you're looking for us. The idea is that we've got a maximum of 1 hour per week. We're going to discuss what's in the news, review the week before, look ahead to the week ahead. There's not a lot of betting talk, to be honest with you. There's a bit of sort of fun and games. And really, we're trying, although we've not succeeded so far because Rory McIlroy and Shane Lowry decided to finish first and second on the PGA Tour. But we're trying to focus on the DP World Tour. So if you do play fancy golf or you bet on the DP World Tour and you want to find out more about these players, you want to hear why Angel Ayora is going to be the next big thing in Spanish golf, then come and listen to us and you'll find out a bit more.
Well, I will tell you at my company, there is a tremendous amount of DP World Tour interest to the point where like we are debating having to create a second channel for the amount of DP World Tour chatter that we get on Monday morning. So hopefully I could bring a couple of my followers and listeners your way as well, because I know they're always searching for more DP World stuff. Ben, thanks for joining me. This was a blast. Best of luck this week at Torrey. Congrats on the new podcast, and excited to chat golf with you again in the near future.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I'll definitely be back. So thanks a lot.